have the distinct pleasure to actually chair this session this morning. This is going to be a multi-format session. So first paper presentation is going to be an hour long, and then two paper presentations, 30 minutes each. So in this first one, it's I don't think Kate needs any introduction, but Dr. Kate Vyborny from World Bank has been part of Pakistan's research ecosystem for a long time. She'll be presenting her paper on women's mobility and labor supply, and she's more than happy to take questions along the way. So this is going to be an hour-long paper presentation. Kate?
So thank you so much, everyone, for being here in this relatively early morning session. This is joint work with Rob Garlick and Erica Field at Duke. So the motivation for this study probably doesn't need a lot of motivation in this setting, but just to kind of recap, we know that women have much lower labor force participation than men in many parts of the world, and South Asia and the Middle East region both have this really strong pattern. And this has continued to be the case even as women advance substantially in terms of their educational achievements. For women in Pakistan who are over 25 years old, only a quarter of them are employed, and that only goes up to 29% for those who have a university degree. And so we care about this for many reasons. One of the reasons is that we think that increasing female labor force participation, allowing women who would like to go into the labor force to go into the labor force, has the potential to raise the aggregate economic output as well as lead to women's empowerment. So what we do in this study is to launch a low-tech, low-cost job matching platform. We enroll a really broad sample of women here in Lahore, in Pakistan, and we are going to experimentally offer multiple different types of transport services for commuting to and from work. And we're going to see how that affects women's labor supply as proxied by job applications on this platform. Just a quick preview of the results. We're going to show that transport offers raise job application rates in a really big way, and particularly if the transport is reserved for women. And that's going to be as valuable as a pretty large discount on the price. Another highlight that I'll get into as we go into the results is that the impacts look similar, if not larger, for women who are out of the labor force at baseline, which suggests that this could be one of the constraints that keeps women not just from working, but even from bothering to search in the first place. So we're going to build on a kind of recently very rapidly growing body of work. So first showing that women face risks of harassment and violence while moving around, getting from place to place, trying to get to jobs or to other things that they want to do outside of their homes. And so there's been work on this in South Asia, but also we also looked at this in the context of Brazil. So this is not unique to only this region. That the risk of harassment is associated with lower female employment, and that women-only transport can lower harassment. This is, again, what we looking at the context of Brazil. We also see evidence that expanding transport infrastructure can increase women's employment, and that facilitating women's access to transport of various kinds can increase employment and search for some subgroups. So here we look at it in the context of Saudi Arabia driving. So that's a bit of a different kind of intervention than I'm going to talk about today. But the kind of the general pattern that mobility constraints are important for women in many contexts. What we do in this paper is to provide the first experimental evidence on the separate importance of the pecuniary factor versus the safety and propriety factor. So is the reason that women are more constrained by mobility just because of cost and access, or is it something to do with their safety and moving around the city? So linking some of these ideas together that are found in these different strands of literature. And we're also going to be able to look at labor force participation to provide some evidence kind of relevant to this question of whether women are just not even bothering to search in the first place because we enroll non-participants in the study. So we're looking at the setting of Lahore, which is roughly 10, I think maybe now 12, in the last count, million people in the larger metro area. In 2018, only 9.8% of women aged 18 to 60 were working, and only 11.2% were labor force participants. So meaning that the vast majority of those who are not working say they're not searching either. However, we do see in surveys, in particular in the DHS, that many women say that they would, if you ask them hypothetically, if you could find something suitable, would you take up work? Many of them say yes. So the numbers from the DHS suggest that about a quarter of women in urban Punjab working, another quarter of them say they're not working, but they would like to work if they could find something suitable. And these patterns match low female labor force participation in many South Asian cities. So here, women are very obviously constrained in terms of mobility, as anybody would have noticed if you've stepped outside the campus. There's safety constraints, there's concerns about harassment. Here's an image of a super crowded bus with the one woman sort of squashed in there, and potentially a lot of worry about physical as well as other kinds of sexual harassment. And there's also social norms that really restrict how women can acceptably move around the city. So here, just to illustrate that women typically, if you just, again, step outside the campus for a bit, and you'll see that if you spend a day counting, like how many times do you see men driving the motorbikes versus women driving the motorbikes. Actually, I get excited whenever I see a woman driving a motorbike. It's not a daily occurrence. So how much does all of this matter for labor supply and for economic output? Well, to try to quantify that, we face 6 challenges, and I'm going to talk about what each one is, and how we address it with the research design. The first challenge is, if we want to kind of isolate this experimentally, we have to, for a treatment group, make the entire journey from home to work safe. If we want to kind of understand how big of an impact are these safety and social constraints on women's labor supply. So it's not enough probably to have, or maybe a partial solution to have a safe bus running from stop to stop, but then what we see repeatedly in all of our formative work and all the qualitative work we've done on this is that going to and from the stop, between the stop and where you need to go, whether it's home to stop, stop to work and back, that last mile problem, as transport experts call it, is really, really important. And women worry a lot about harassment in that part of the journey. So that's the first challenge. Second challenge is that if we want to be able to understand kind of how big of an importance this has for female labor supply, it's a bit tricky because there are many thousands of possible firms or employers at which women could work. At each one of them, a given woman has a very, very small probability of matching, right? Whether it's that, if we just focused our study on commuting to a particular hospital, then it would only be relevant for women who've already trained as nurses, for example, which might not really reflect the population I was just referring to, who are not even bothering to kind of search or enter or maybe even train for those kinds of occupation in the first place. Third, would like to be able to separately understand how much of the constraint is really about safety and social acceptability versus just pure kind of cost and access constraints. The fourth, which I was just alluding to, that we want to include in the sample women who just don't even bother to search in the first place, which is not standard in a lot of the experimental literature. Fifth, if we're offering some kind of a commute option in an experimental setting, and this was something we grappled with a lot in the early stages, we need to make sure that participants understand what jobs they can reach with safer commute. In early piloting that we did of different kinds of transport interventions that we could offer, this was a big challenge because women are not searching, in part because, I will argue, because they can't safely get around the city. They don't know the geography of the city, and so if you send them a job ad, or if they might hear about a job in a particular place, they won't be able to very easily mentally map that to, oh, I can take this transport route to get there. And so even if you inform women that there's a safe transport running, kind of linking that together with the job opportunities they could be applying for can be tricky. And then finally, it might be that an offer of a safe commute of some kind could increase women's willingness to take up work, but they might not know how to search. This is definitely a kind of something we've explored a lot in other work that I'll talk about tomorrow afternoon briefly. Or they might not get jobs because of firm-side factors, firm discrimination, for example, many other things that happen on the firm side. So it could be that offering the safe transport in an experimental setting makes women much more interested in working, but you don't actually see anything downstream because they don't find any job that will hire them. And so we may have difficulty observing observing the labor supply decision. Traditionally, what we would do in a household survey is just ask about search, like, are you searching? But this is, given that a lot of search happens informally and search is, we have a whole measurement paper about kind of how you measure search. It's difficult to do, especially in these kinds of settings. So we might have a hard time kind of observing increase in labor supply. So I'll tell you what we do with each of these 6 challenges. Yeah.
Just going back to the first constraint, is that the fundamental one that stops the market solving this problem?
The door-to-door?
The door-to-door.
Yes.
But is that also what makes it difficult to think of an intervention that's going to be scalable as well?
Absolutely. I'm going to talk about that. My last sort of 4 slides or so are dedicated to worrying about exactly that question. Yeah.
Just to confirm, the third challenge means that you are offering safe transport, but not necessarily free transport.
Yeah, we want to be able to separate out.
Okay.
So you might think that women have differential cost constraints in terms of mobility. So let's say that none of this safety and acceptability stuff that I was talking about was relevant. You might still see differences in gendered response to transport treatment because, for example, women's potential earning power is lower, and so a given bus ticket actually represents a larger fraction of their wage. And so that would be a purely cost constraint. And so we want to be able to tease out like how much is coming from each of these things. Any other? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's related to Imran's question. I was wondering, so the moment you stop the experiment and you withdraw the transport opportunity, but you have matched these women to jobs, how do you think about this ethically?
Yeah, so I will kind of talk about this a bit more when I talk about how we introduce the safe transport offer. But we inform them up front how long it's guaranteed to be offered to them at that price. And then the idea is, we're actually kind of moving towards field wrap up now. The idea is that they can potentially, if they choose to do so, they could continue to use it at cost after that. I can talk more about that when we get. Okay. So the intervention is a safe commute service. So this is what we do to try to address challenges 1 and 2, i.e. make the entire journey safe and acceptable, and allow women to access many possible job matches, not just sort of say one specific firm. This is a subscription-based door-to-door, what is called here pick and drop service. And that's, so just to kind of clear what we're doing here, we're not getting women to interviews. So there have been other studies, less focused on gender, but just looking at this question of sort of the spatial frictions around search. That's not, in this, we do that, we're kind of doing that elsewhere, but in this paper we are looking at the kind of regular cost and difficulties that women encounter with commute. So that's how it works. It's like a daily back and forth, door to door. The employee can choose whether or not to opt in and pay a monthly subscription. And we're going to randomize this two-sided by firms and job seekers. So this is not an unknown thing that firms might offer or that might exist in this market. A small minority of firms offer this kind of service. It's generally a bit more, sorry, there's a bit sort of all different shades of pink, which is my fault, but it's a bit more, it's more common among larger firms and less common among smaller firms, but in none of these buckets is this like something that the majority of firms do, but it is something that people have heard about. So when you tell them, oh, there's going to be a pick and drop, they have some idea what you're referring to. Yeah.
Them up and drop them off? Where does that fit in? Is it not considered safe or is it too costly? Because I see a lot of they have these rickshaws just dedicated to picking and dropping them off. That's presumably cheaper than this?
This is, I think you should think about that as being very similar. Yeah. So there's two things going on there. As you say, that one question might be, some people, we haven't collected specific survey data about that, but my prior would be that just calling a random rickshaw that has a sign on the back of his vehicle saying pick and drop call 0300 whatever, there might be a little bit more of a trust gap. We try to bridge that by offering it through our service. Of course, it's difficult to sort of solve that entirely. So that's one piece of it. But otherwise, I think you should think about the technology being very similar. Then the other piece is, which is I think in some sense the main thing that we're doing in the intervention is coordinating it, right? So the guy who just has the phone number on the back of his rickshaw, he's kind of coordinating it directly. But in general, it's one of the difficulties of doing door to door is, to do it efficiently, you need to have people being picked from similar areas and going to similar areas. Otherwise, the rickshaw goes sort of all over the place, and that starts to increase the time and the cost. So in the RCT, we're going to try to address the third challenge, i.e. separating the effect of safety and acceptability versus the pecuniary cost by having several different kind of things that we do in the experiment. The first is that we have two different treatment arms for women. One in which they're offered a female-only transport, which implies, the fact that it's female-only implies that it's safe, socially acceptable, as well as convenient, versus a mixed gender transport, which is just purely convenient. So it allows us to kind of separate out this accessibility versus at least a part of, not all, but a part of the safety and social constraint. We're also going to cross-randomize a discount, which is going to allow us to further tease out this cost versus safety thing. And then finally, we also enroll a sample of men, which allows us to further document the gender differences in the mobility constraint. Yeah, sorry.
Just one clarification question. So over here, we're thinking of acceptability being mainly about safety. So once a transport is safe for a woman, it becomes acceptable in the household.
Yeah, so in the sense that we're not doing anything in this intervention at all to deal with questions like, does my husband even want me to, is he okay with me working? Maybe my in-laws are aggravated because I'm not home to serve chai to their guests. None of that is being addressed, of course, by this. But in the sense that the reason I'm kind of grouping these two things together, where are they? The safe and socially acceptable, those get bundled by an intervention like this. So broadly speaking, you could think like safety is about avoiding non-consensual interaction, physical harassment. Acceptability also crosses over into the possibility of consensual interaction that's not deemed socially acceptable, or like going across the bounds of propriety. So just to make it more concrete, if my family, so if I know that I'm going to go on a women-only vehicle, I know that it's very much unlikely that somebody's going to grope me on that vehicle.
It's already norm responsive, basically.
Yeah, but also my husband and in-laws know, or my parents know, that it's unlikely I'm going to meet a boyfriend on that vehicle. So both of those things are bundled together in this, and we're going to present a little bit of evidence on heterogeneity to try to say something more about that. But the experimental design is not set up in a way that allows us to separate them out. We do a little bit more on that in the using IATs and things like that in the Brazil work. But the TLDR is both of those things seem to matter. So the many studies in the experimental kind of job search and employment literature start out with a sample of people who are already searching. Like you go to a job search service of some kind, or enroll people who are finishing a skills training that's geared towards helping them find a better job, and enroll those people and then offer them some kind of treatment on an experimental basis. What we're going to do instead, which is more of a pain but we think really worth it, is to start with a representative listing of households from a randomly selected set of enumeration blocks all across the city, and invite people to sign up for a job search service. And we end up with about 10,000 people signing up. Why do we do this? It's to address challenge 4, which is that we want to include women in the sample who are not bothering to search to begin with for various constraints, which could potentially include the mobility one. And so we are kind of, I'll talk about this more tomorrow afternoon, but a number of studies from the Job Talash platform are kind of cross-validating this idea of latent female labor supply in this setting, meaning that there are women out there, and possibly quite a lot of them, who would like to work but are not searching and therefore not classed as labor force active in any of these sorts of surveys or national kind of statistics. We do in fact see that the majority of women subscribers who sign up for the service are not searching, not doing anything to search at baseline. We're going to repeat a similar process of these enumeration blocks for enrolling employers. So what do we do with this? The firms are invited to post ads on the Job Talash platform, and they post ads all the way across the spectrum, which is something we're really happy about. That, you know, you see ads for sweepers on Job Talash, you see ads for HR managers on Job Talash, and everything in between. So then I said at the beginning, it's kind of a low-tech, low-cost platform. The candidate's going to receive the job announcement through the SMS when he or she meets basic qualifications of the job, and also express interest at the sign-up stage, which they can say which types of occupations they'd like to be sent alerts for. So then how do we link this together with the transport? So now in the SMS for the treatment group, all the groups are going to receive information on where the job is and the cost of the status quo commute, as well as the salary being posted by the firm for the position. But the treatment group are also going to receive an offer of pick and drop offered by Job Talash listed job, guaranteed for at least a year. So this is saying that you know, there's a job ad for Hijab, who was one of our fantastic team members some time back, and she keeps appearing again and again in these presentations. So it's she's been matched to a salesperson job with a salary of 12 to 15,000 rupees a month. This is where it's located. But with this particular ad, there's transport being offered that's women only, transport sirf aurtan ke liye. Only the job seeker is informed about the transport. The firm is not informed in any of the stages that we're going to talk about in this paper. And so this is going to address challenge 5, which is ensuring that participants learn which jobs they can reach with this safe commute. So we're now trying to link it all together. All of this is a result of tons of earlier stage piloting of things that didn't work. I think I know there's a lot of early career researchers kind of encouraged to engage in this workshop, and I think there's a bit of a there can often be a bit of a sense of, here's one I made earlier in these presentations, like everything looks like it came together sort of from day one with this solving all of these problems, but the problems are were developed as we were problems are identified as we were developing and piloting different ways of trying to address this, and then ultimately this is how we set up the design to solve all of them. So this means that we can observe the choice set and the supply decision, as well as any firm responses. So in addition to this basic information that appears in the SMS that I showed, oh yes, somebody, yes.
So they only get that information, but they have to call to understand that it's for 1 year, and that will actually be linked to that.
They get a call first.
Okay.
So they get a call before they start getting the treatment SMSs. They get a briefing call, which is this. So this is the script from the briefing call, and this aims to provide kind of more information about in general how the transport's going to operate, as well as try to shut down some mechanisms we might be worried about activating with this transport offer. So this is for the treatment group that gets women-only transport. Job Talash is offering a pick and drop service for only women. So sorry, this one is the one where we're reiterating for a specific job, but they get a similar briefing at the beginning before they get any, but like at the inception of getting these matches. So we try to clarify that the company may have men, women, or a mix of both. Meaning that we're not, because you might be worried that by telling people there's a women-only transport, we're signaling that maybe the job has a lot of women. That would be a natural thing to conclude, and so we are emphasizing that the pick and drop is offered by us, and then it's taking you to a company which might have more men. It's not linked to their company. The van will be taking other people to this area where the offices are, and it's only going to be offered for some job. And if with a particular job ad it's offered, then you're going to get that information in SMS. It's not required, so you don't have to automatically. One thing you might worry about is if people think it's required and they don't want it, then they would sort of subtract the cost of it from the salary and think, well, I want my husband to drop me off on his motorbike, but I still have to pay for this stupid thing. So that reduces my net salary offer. And so we emphasize this throughout. Regardless of whether you want it, you're still going to get job ads. It's not going to affect whether you're interested in it is not going to affect your application for the job. Yeah.
So just to go back to the previous slide, is that the reason why you didn't inform firms?
Yeah, so we want to isolate the supply the supply response.
Could you imagine there's a nice interaction with how firms would behave if they know that women are more likely to be able to commute to work?
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. They could also just take that out of their salary as well. So they could be.
Yes. We have done some piloting in that. We've done piloting in that space on the firm-facing piece. We haven't ended up putting it into this paper, mainly for power reasons. Yeah. So our main analysis is going to focus on the female job seekers, and then I'll have like one graph that shows how the male job seekers respond. So the main sample, we've got 54,000 matches, and by a match I just mean it's one instance in which a job seeker receives an SMS about a particular job, and then we can observe whether or not that job seeker decides to apply for that specific job. So that's what I mean by a match, between 2,500 female job seekers and 172 job ads over the course of this piece of the study. We're going to observe, one of the really kind of nice things about this setup with job collage is we observe exactly the same information that the job seeker observes. There is nothing that they know at any of these stages that we're going to study here that we don't know. So there's no interaction between the firm and the job seeker, which could result in, firms possibly finding out about the transport, using that to decide whether to do something, or job seekers using information about from an interview to decide about whether to apply. None of that's happening here because we see what they see. So the main outcome we're going to be looking at here is applications. And we do this to isolate the labor supply decision from demand-side decisions about how to select applicants. Labor supply decisions in general may reflect beliefs about the demand side. We're not getting into that in this study. Okay, before I jump into results, any other clarifying questions or points people want to share? Okay. So, the impact of this thing is very large on job search. So I'll just kind of walk through each of these sets of bars. So first we're going to pool together the impact of offering any transport at any price. And so here we do see a pretty big increase in the rate of application to any given job ad that a woman receives on the platform. But then when we break it down into these treatment arms of women only and mix, what we see is that if you look at the female only transport offer, it's more than doubling the rate of application to a job. And that suggests that social and safety constraints seem really important in this setting. We also see, and I pushed a lot on this idea that we're enrolling women who were neither working nor searching at baseline, and we're really excited to see that we do actually see them responding. The response actually looks pretty similar, if not, the point estimates are a little bit larger. These are not significantly different from each other. But women who are not in the labor, but in a sense, that's not really what we're testing here. What we want to know is, can women who are not in the labor force to begin with respond to this offer and search more, and we see that they do. We also, as I said, enroll a sample of men and do everything with them similar to what I described with women, except that there's no male-only transport arm, in part because the formative work we did, and any conversation with anybody who lives here will probably reveal that very few men would actually be interested in this. And this is what you can also see here, that women respond to the transport offer. This is just, again, pooling any transport offer at any price. Men just totally ignore it. We pre-registered a set of baseline characteristics for heterogeneity testing. We report all of those in the paper, but here in the presentation, I'm just going to focus on a couple, one that we just talked about, the labor force status at baseline, then a couple that tell us something a little bit about safety and social norms. So at baseline, we asked the household respondent, which is usually a woman, how concerned are you about safety in your neighborhood and moving around in your neighborhood? And those who, so if we focus, so overall, the impact of offering transport is a lot bigger for them. And those who are not very worried about safety in their neighborhood are more responsive, and they're more responsive to mixed transport. So women who are concerned about safety basically ignore mixed gender transport. Moreover, married women completely ignore mixed gender transport. So both of these two variables are not actually correlated, not actually correlated in our data at all. And so these two patterns suggest that there may be a role for both the safety and the social propriety concerns in this revealed preference for gender segregated commuting. So I mentioned at the beginning that we cross-randomized the discount rate, the discount of the monthly cost of the commute at different levels. So we offer it at a 20% discount, a 60%, and an 80% discount. And what we see is that women's response is really driven by a very heavily discounted transport offer. If we look just at kind of the impact at the 20% discount, they just are not responding to it at all. And but if we look at the very heavily discounted form, that's more than tripling the application rate for the job. And so this is kind of going to lead into the question that you were asking about sustainability and scalability. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the base price and the rickshaw price are the same.
Okay,
yeah.
So they'll always be cheaper. So even though it's cheaper than a rickshaw, they're still not taking it out.
Yeah, so and just to be clear here, just to be clear here, what we're looking at is always whether they apply to the job. But of course, you can infer that they wouldn't be interested in taking up the transport if there's no response to the job application. Yeah.
The question I had was, do the firms know that these job seekers are going to be offered this transport?
No, they don't. Not in this paper.
I see. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So they can't be responding in any way in fact, everything we're looking at here occurs sort of before the job application package even gets sent to the firms. So they can't be responding in any way. This is all just looking at the labor supply decision as proxied by applying for the job.
So quick clarifying question. So these discounts are not tied to any particular job. So any job that they're applying for, these discounts are going to apply.
It's randomized. So it's randomized two ways. So if I'm a control job seeker, I never see any transport offer. Yeah. If I'm a treatment job seeker then I get one type of transport offer, because it's otherwise confusing to mix, like for the same person, different kinds of offers. So if I'm in the women only transport arm, then for some of the job opportunities, then I see job ads for that have a transport offer, and in some of them I don't. And I didn't include this in the deck, but we do look at spillovers, and there's not a lot of spillovers happening between.
So jobs. They are tied to some jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Bless you.
you said that women are wanting the high discount. Is it because only those who are at the lower end of the income spectrum are opting in, or they're heavily opting in for this?
Yeah, so I'm gonna show in. I'm gonna talk more about about this result and kind of what what we can unpack from it in the next few slides. But actually, if anything, the more educated and like more sort of higher earning power women are the ones that respond more. And that is because they're even at a discount, it still ends up being expensive for women who are in the lowest potential earning bracket. So like if you think about somebody who might be working in say a sanitation job at LUMS, like a janitor, then the cost, even the cost for, like, given the type of salary that she might earn, the cost even at a discounted rate still eats up a pretty big part of the salary.
One more clarification. I may have missed this. So how many women to a van, and what was the average commute time?
We guaranteed them that it would be maximum of like a 12-seater, but in fact, when we've because of the economies of scale, when we operated it, we often did it smaller than that, so like a smaller vehicle with fewer people. I don't think we ever had a full-size van running.
So when looking at alternatives that they may have, this may, I mean, this is cheaper, but they may still be a bit more convenient in terms of how long it may take them to get to home. And like, if let's suppose there are 12 people that have to be dropped before I get dropped.
Yes.
That's a consideration for me, regardless
definitely.
of cost.
Yeah.
But you're saying most of the times it was much smaller. So again, going back to Mehreen's comment about rickshaw, in a rickshaw you'd have about 4 to 5 women. Something similar here also?
Yeah, that's actually what happened. But we shouldn't think about that as affecting any of these decisions, because all of that gets realized to them after all of this happens. So at this point, they're responding to being offered. What we told them in the script is you can be on a like a highest, basically. So like it's sort of 12-passenger van. So if we had told them that you're going to get, we didn't experiment with things like telling them about different amount of time. That would be interesting, but there's just already so much going on in this project. But you could potentially experiment with seeing how sensitive they are to commute time and other kind of features of the convenience of the vehicle. And I agree that would probably magnify the impact. So we should think, in that sense, if that turns out to be important, we should think about this as a lower bound, because women who think, as you said, oh gosh, I don't want to sit on the van while 10 annoying other people get dropped, or I wait for them because they're still blow drying their hair. And this happened actually. When we were piloting, we had issues with, the van is outside of the person's home and they're not coming out because they're still getting ready and everyone else is irritated. So to the extent that all of that matters, which surely for some people it does, then that should make these more of a lower bound.
Hi. So this kind of connects to the last question, but so the women who got no offer of any transport, were they told the distance from their home or the locality in which okay. And you just really went over very quickly the slide comparing married and unmarried women. I hope you're going to talk about that as we go on, because I'm also interested in difference between married and unmarried, and also age.
Yeah.
Related or not related to whether they're married or not.
I can go back to that. I don't have another slide about it. By age, I'll say here that, okay. So these are, I should say here, this is a little confusing because the bars here are treatment effects, whereas these bars were all means. These are coefficients, because otherwise it just becomes a ton of bars in one graph. So each of these bars is like how much does the particular group respond to the transport offer? So unmarried women respond a lot. Married women, we don't see a very strong response to this offer like pooling everything together. When we separate it out, unmarried women respond to mixed gender transport, and married women, we don't see any response. Yeah, and then the responses look similar between the two groups for the women-only transport. So this is why we're arguing. So being married or unmarried also is like correlated with other things, and this is not the experimental design isn't set up to really neatly separate out social norms from and the propriety concerns from safety, but these results are sort of suggestive that there's something related to social norms going on, that married women maybe face more constraints from their husbands, in-laws with regard to sitting on a van with unknown men. Yeah. Okay.
Amount of work that must have gone into pulling all of this together. I can't even begin to imagine. But I was wondering that you talk about application rates. Is this a one-off thing that you guys observe? I'm wondering if the behavior is sustainable, like what happens after 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? And do they also, do these higher application rates also transition into higher, work, being in the labor market? Like, do they actually transition into the labor force? So if you could comment on that.
So sadly, we're not powered for that. And it's sort of a trade-off in the sense that what we have invested a lot into trying to really pinpoint responses at the supply stage. There's a lot of other stuff going on. Once somebody submits an application, there's many other things going on, of course. And we have another paper with Zunia and others looking at data from the platform, which I'll allude to briefly in tomorrow afternoon's session. But the basic takeaway of that paper is that the quantitatively really large component of the gender gap in job search is coming from the demand side. So if women, submit applications and then they don't get any response, then that obviously kind of dampens what we can see in terms of the follow through to employment. But the big reason that we're not able to capture that is just because we invested so many resources in trying to pinpoint like the initial supply response. We don't have enough people kind of coming through to the end of the pipeline to be able to kind of see a significant impact on employment. The first thing you were asking about is a time horizon. So all of this happened, it kind of rolls out over a period. I think the period of time that we're using in the data in this paper is something like 1.5 years. And the reason is that the whole platform is sort of running on a rolling basis. So every month, job seekers who've signed up receive a set of ads by SMS, which they can decide to apply for or not apply for. To get those job ads, we need to go and approach employers, and then we need to kind of send out the information. So it sort of happens on a flow basis. I don't think I feel like we must at some point have looked at whether there's, looked at sort of differential effects over time, and I guess we probably haven't seen much going on there because I don't remember, but I'd have to go back and check. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Do you want to, Mike, did you?
I was just wondering, are you powered to detect heterogeneous responses by characteristics of the job? In particular, sort of the gender composition of the workplace, and whether sort of relaxing constraints on commuting has bigger impacts on getting women into female-dominated workplaces.
Right. So we have looked at some job characteristics, but the reason that we didn't include that one in our heterogeneity plan was because in this experimental sample, women don't know the gender composition of the job. They could potentially infer it from the occupation and the firm name to some extent. One of my co-authors who's worked on other parts of the Job Talash platform, her job market paper was actually just drilling in on this. So she did an experiment with a different sample where she told women about how many women and men are in the job and whether the supervisor is male or female. And that does matter, but we're not set up to look at how those things interact here because we separated the samples intentionally so not to make things too messy. I think that would be really interesting, but it would have to be, if we wanted to infer something about it, it would have to be quite indirect, because we'd have to think like, okay, well, women probably look at a teaching job and assume they're more likely to be women in it, which is, that's true, but it's also noisy, and for many occupations they might not know, and so I think it was a little harder. Yeah.
Kate, I'm wondering, is there any variation in your sample in work hours of the job? And if the response varies depending on what the working hours are?
So it's very similar to the point we were just discussing on the gender composition, which is that yes, there is, but they're not proactively told about that information at the time that they make this application. We've never run an experiment on job telash yet where we experimented with that. We do. So in the paper that looks at kind of how much is demand versus supply side that I was just alluding to, we do look a little bit at this issue of working hours, but since we're not sort of throwing that information at job seekers during the initial apply decision, so it means that any response to it is kind of mechanically muted. I would imagine it would probably be pretty strong if we did that.
Kate, just a follow-up related question. So yeah, I understand that those things weren't shared with the job seekers, but I wonder if the location of the firm is something that they could infer.
Yes, and we tell them, yeah.
So is it do you see heterogeneous effects by that, and is it that applications are higher to at least places or for employers that are close to them?
They're more responsive to yes, we do, and they're more responsive to jobs that are to the treatment for jobs that are further away, but it's not as strong of a difference as you might expect because of this last mile problem. That even if a job, and there's a couple of reasons that they're not as strong. One is that if the job is further away, it's also more expensive. So the cost of the service is not a flat rate. It's based, as you would normally expect a transport service to be, based in part on distance. And so even at the discount, it still starts to become expensive for further jobs. So in general, the application rate gets kind of depressed by that. And secondly, because of the last mile problem. So even a job that's close to you is still, there's still kind of a fixed cost in terms of the safety and propriety issues from just stepping outside the door. Okay, so I talked about this, right? So the response really seemed driven by this very heavy subsidy. So because we've cross-randomized the subsidy, it also means that we can try to put a number on like how much do women value women-only transport, like how much would that be equivalent in terms of money amount. And this is relevant. So what we're doing in the experiment is sort of something that it wouldn't usually or maybe ever be done by a government at a large scale. But what they do at a large scale is having like women reserved spaces, which happens in over 17 countries across 5 continents that we could find documentation of. And so understanding kind of how valuable is this for women is kind of a helpful thing to do. So we use this price randomization to estimate this. And so the basic takeaway of this is that application rates equalize if you offer women-only transport or if you offer an 81 percentage point larger discount rate. So this maybe shouldn't be super surprising given the bars that I was just showing, that basically you have to, you have to, does that include the discussion time, or I guess it's all one big bucket, but that's fine because we've had lots of good discussion already. So it suggests that women have put a really high valuation on women-only transport relative to cheaper mixed-gender transport, but all of these estimates turn out to be quite very imprecise. And if we model it a few different ways, and they all give us large numbers that are imprecisely estimated, but it still gives you something kind of, I think, a useful back of the envelope of how important this is. Okay, so back to the question you asked right at the beginning. Could this be scaled? No. So for many job matches, providing the pick and drop actually at the base cost actually costs the entire salary. So what we've done, not all of them, but so what we just, I'll walk you through what's happening in this graph. So at first I should say, I think you saw this in the map. Those who are familiar with Lahore would have noticed the map at the beginning where I showed all of the different locations where we sampled. All of this, I would very strongly say, is one commuting area for men. For men, it's one big commuting area. Lots of people, in fact, maybe I'll even just take a second here to show you that map one more time. Here it is. So Shadra, Gajumata, these are people, definitely you see men in surveys. Also, we should probably write this down somewhere because we have data that we can use to show this. There are a lot of men who commute kind of these sorts of distances across this entire metro area. So it's a one commuting area in which we're matching people with potential jobs. So what we do in the red graph, go back to the red graph, is we just take all of these possible job matches. So each observation is one person with one job that we sent them that they qualified for, at least on the basics, and that they were interested in the occupation. So these are like, what's the scope of possible search? We take those matches, we divide them into quartiles by how far away the job seeker and the job are from each other. And so in the closest quartile, the median distance is only 4 kilometers. In the furthest, the median distance is 18 kilometers. Still not super far, right? Then what's on the y-axis here, this height of the bar, is saying, okay, the base cost of the transport, which is what we offered, what we're calling the base here is sort of pegged to what we think it should be, like it's based on the cost of running this privately. The base cost of the transport is, for the closest jobs, a quarter of the salary. For the furthest job, like the 25% of the jobs that are further from the job seeker's home, it's 100% of the salary. Is expensive, is what I'm just trying to say. So what do we do with all of this? What I've argued is that social and safety limitations that constrain women's mobility around the city really can dramatically reduce female labor supply, and that this is very costly, potentially contributing to women who might be interested in working, not searching, being out of the labor force, and ultimately reduced aggregate output. Pick and drop can ease this constraint because it can address the safety concerns, the propriety concerns, all the way from the doorstep to the doorstep, like fixing this last mile problem. But it's just too expensive. Now it would become more efficient with scale. So if you move towards like doing this at a very large scale with all the firms and all the workers, then you would be able to just I would be able to get picked up with my 3 neighbors from my street and who work in the same area and go straight to that area and get dropped. That would definitely make it cheaper than it is now at base, but not much, not enough to really make it feasible for many workers. So what should we do with this information? I had an opportunity to present this at the Punjab Transport Expo last week, which was sort of a big, more event with more of the political actors who are really like working a lot on transport in the province. And so I spent a bit of time kind of setting up these slides, which I've now imported into the academic presentation, because I just think it's this important to think about. So should we be subsidizing it? So there could be good reasons in principle, in general, to subsidize women's mobility, definitely. One is that, so I just said that it could be, women-only transport options could become more cost-effective if women, if they attract, as over time they attract more female riders and ultimately more women enter the workforce and move in the public space. So for example, the pink buses, which many of you guys have seen in Lahore, they're very, they run at much lower number of riders per bus as compared to the regular buses. So if over time you get more men into the public space, then it can become more efficient because they fill the vehicle more. But that's still, as I said, there's a limit to how much that solves. You could also make other arguments. So for example, young women, especially professional young women, like women who are graduating, say, from LUMS and looking for their first job, if they're mobility constrained, many of them may actually have private drivers, but those that don't, you could think, well, early in their career, how much they're going to earn is not going to be enough to cover this and still make it worth it to work. But for women in that sort of demographic may have an upward trajectory over their experience of making a lot more. And so maybe when you graduate and get a job at 50,000 rupees a month, and the transport is costing 40, then you might think about it as an investment. I'm going to spend most of my salary on the transport now, and then later in my career, I'll be earning 200,000 or 300,000 a month, and it's going to start to pay off. A lot of women in the US think about childcare this way. I'm sure that those of you who live in the US or have talked to American women of childbearing age may have heard this idea that, okay, the childcare is taking up my entire salary, but I don't want to leave the labor force because once my kids are in school, then I'm not paying as much anymore, and I don't want to, and I need to keep moving on the career trajectory. Is this a case for subsidy? Only if there's a credit constraint, which there definitely could be. But we really should be thinking realistically about more cost-effective and scalable approaches. So what does this mean? Well, we have mass transit already with reserved spaces that is much more cost-effective than pick and drop. This is very heavily used and heavily demanded. And as I said a minute ago, it exists in over 17 countries sort of worldwide. So this is an argument sort of in favor of that, and in general in favor of high quality public transport services, because standing at the stop late at night, waiting for a bus when you don't know if and when it's going to come, for a quarter of an hour is scary. It's scary. And so offering something like a BRT here, which comes very frequently, and I know it's going to come in just a few minutes. I don't have that uncertainty. It has a lighted stop. It's kind of got a proper infrastructure. That's a big plus. But that doesn't solve this last mile journey. So to solve the last mile journey, we have to look outside of the transport sector. So those can mean things like street lights, female police officers, and my Sarjal colleague has this fantastic study which looked at visible hotspot policing in Hyderabad, India, which they found reduced sexual harassment significantly. So these are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about from a public policy perspective. We don't see this study as showing like, here's a thing that we did on a small scale, let's scale it up. We think about this as saying, here's a study that shows that this is really, really matters. It's expensive in an economic output sense, and that it really motivates why we ought to be doing more of this kind of stuff that we know can work to address the safety problem on the last mile.
So, I mean, when we get into these normative questions, then I think there's one other piece of the puzzle you really need to tell us about a little bit more, which is what raises a lot of the questions, which is the nature of search that is then induced by relaxing transportation constraints. So, if as a result women direct their search to certain types of employer, does that actually lead to a reinforcement of employer-based norms? So, by relaxing one constraint, you might make other constraints more binding.
Yeah.
It's just a classic theory of the second best that, if we relax a subset of constraints here, and you kind of suggested that employer-based constraints are really first order here, could you actually make things worse overall? And so I think you have the data to say a little bit more about, the bunch of questions that came up about which types of jobs are women searching for, and then thinking through, what would actually be the general equilibrium effects of relaxing one set of constraints. It might make it harder in the long run. It might actually relax those other constraints. But I think that's an important piece of the puzzle when talking about these normative questions of what should we then do?
Yeah. So, for example,
I can suggest you can answer this question, and then we have to move to the next paper. Really prepared question.
Yes, sounds good. So maybe we can talk more offline because I don't want to eat into the next person's time. Thank you all so much. And I wanted just shout out CERP, a big team of people over time who've made this possible, some of whom are here, and funding for the larger Job to Lash program, which includes tons of studies from many generous funders. Thanks.
Excellent paper. Kate, and you can tell by the number of questions. So the next paper is cash and cognition, the impact of transfer timing on standardized test scores. Axel Larrinaga.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. My name is Eizmandi. I'm a PhD student in economics at Tufts University, and I will be presenting some joint work with my co-author, Germán. So to start with a little bit of motivation, cash transfer programs are one of the primary anti-poverty policies in developing countries. For example, in Latin America alone, 18 countries have a cash transfer program, benefiting more than 135 million individuals. So given their central role that they play in social protection, optimizing how we design these programs is crucial. And there has been a lot of research on different design features, such as how to best target beneficiaries, whether we should condition payments on specific behaviors or whether we should make them unconditional. But there's been very little research on the timing aspect, whether timing of transfers might actually be a design feature that could make programs better. Now, timing-based adjustments could be particularly low cost because they could be potentially quite budget neutral and therefore quite valuable in resource-constrained settings like lower income countries. The traditional view, sort of a neoclassical view, would be that the timing of regularly occurring transfers that someone is getting every month should be pretty irrelevant because when you're getting your transfer, you would just smooth consumption over time and there shouldn't really be any reason to worry about the timing. But there's many reasons why we might think that consumption and other outcomes may not be smooth around the payment date of cash transfers. Empirically and theoretically, there's credit or liquidity constraint stories that we can think of and that have been highlighted in the literature. There's present bias and other sort of cognitive mechanisms like limited cognition and optimization errors that people make that have been highlighted in recent behavioral economics literature. And in fact, we know from high-income countries like the US that consumption is actually sensitive to the arrival of very much predictable and perfectly anticipated payments. So we know that people don't really seem to smooth consumption in high-income countries. And one implication of this, if consumption and outcomes are not smooth around the transfer payment date, there's the potential for transfer timing around high-stakes events, such as, for example, college admissions exams, to have long-term consequences. And the causal chain that we have in mind here is, suppose we have a specific type of timing around the high-stakes exam that affects the consumption or welfare of the participant in this high-stakes event, in the lead-up to this high-stakes event, in turn impacting their performance in the high-stakes event. And because this is a high-stakes event, it can in turn sort of shift the trajectory of this individual. For example, again, high-stakes exams that might determine whether you go to college or not. And in turn, the performance in this exam would be quite consequential. So what this paper is trying to do, exploiting a cash transfer program in Brazil, is first it asks, how does the timing of cash transfers around the high-stakes college admission exam impact scores on that exam? And in turn, we can then follow the same students and ask whether there are any consequences for their long-term human capital accumulation and their labor market outcomes between 8 and 10 years after taking this exam. So I'll start with a bit of institutional context, tell you about the cash transfer program, about the higher education context in Brazil. I'll tell you the data and the sample, give you a description of the research design, and then we'll look at the impact of the transfer timing on performance on the exam itself, and then on longer-term outcomes. So the conditional cash transfer program in question is called Bolsa Familia. Some of you might be familiar with it. It is the biggest conditional cash transfer program in the world, and it's providing monthly payments to beneficiaries. To be eligible, households have to be below the poverty line, which is measured based on per capita income. And it covers more than 20 million households, so almost a quarter of the Brazilian population. And it's actually one of the biggest sources of federal spending in Brazil, only second to pensions and retirement payments. So this is a massive, massive program in Brazil. The average transfer size is around $94, which compared to an average monthly income of $197 is actually quite a sizable share of household income. And the size is going to depend on several factors, mostly household demographic composition, because households would get a payment per number of children that they have, for example, but also on the depth of their poverty. Now, importantly, the benefits are paid once a month. There's no uncertainty around when they get paid, and everybody knows the dates ex ante. And what's going to be quite crucial to our identification strategy is the fact that the day each month in which someone gets paid depends on the last digit of this number called the NIS number. And the NIS number is a number that households get assigned randomly when they enroll in a social program in Brazil. A little bit about the higher education context in Brazil. So Brazil has both public and private colleges. Public colleges are free, there's no tuition to be paid, but they're extremely selective and they require really high exam scores to get in. We have a lot of private colleges. They're actually the majority in Brazil. They require paying tuition, but they're actually mostly open admission. So very few private universities will reject a student who wants to get in, unless it's one of the top private universities in the country. Now, admission to public colleges is purely based on exam scores. And while some universities have their own university-specific exam, most rely on this exam called the NM exam, which is the one that we will be studying here. And to tell you a little bit more about the NM exam, you know, this is not a very US audience, but maybe you're familiar with the SAT or the ACT. These are standardized tests that are quite popular in the US. So there's about 5 million test takers each year, which makes it the second biggest college admission test in the world. And it's quite a grueling exam. It's 180 multiple choice questions across 4 subjects, math, language, natural sciences, and social sciences. And at the end of the day, at the end of the exam, they have to write an essay. In total, it's about 10 to 11 hours of testing. So again, quite taxing, cognitively speaking. And one important aspect of the exam is that not only does it determine admission to public colleges, it is also used to rank students nationwide to give them government scholarships, government loans. So it actually also serves as an important pathway into private higher education. In terms of data, all this analysis I basically had to do in the secure data facility in Brazil. And the reason for that is that all the admin databases have to be merged using encrypted national IDs. So we have the NM exam records, which give us student level test scores, student level data, which give us test scores, age, and a bunch of other demographic characteristics. We have question level data. We can know what each person answered to each question in the exam. And then we combine that with the registry of social programs and the cash transfer data, which allows us to identify the last digit of the NIS of each household, how much they're getting paid every month, and when do they withdraw their transfer. By the way, you said 10 minutes? Are you sure?
Yeah, because we'll have 20 minutes of presentation and 10 minutes of questions.
Okay, because I thought it was a 30-minute presentation.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Okay. Okay, I'll skip through this. So just to, okay. And then we look at long-term outcomes through the Census of Higher Education and this matched employee-employer database that will tell us the universe of formal sector workers in Brazil and will allow us to look at whether students are entering the formal labor market afterwards. So our sample is going to be 184,000 high school seniors who took the 2013 exam, and I'll tell you why we focus on 2013. And all their families received the transfer. The only difference is going to be when they got the transfer, whether before or after the exam. Okay, research design. So how does the research design work? Each month, the payments are staggered across the last 13 to 14 days of the month. And as I was alluding to earlier, when you get paid depends on the last digit of this random number. So by definition, we have random variation on the day in which individuals get paid each month. In 2013, we have this nice natural experiment where about 60% of beneficiaries got paid in the week leading up to the exam, and the remaining 40% got paid right after the exam. And we should think of this group that got paid after the exam as being at the end of their sort of monthly payment cycle. So to the extent that there's a binding liquidity constraints towards the end of the month, they're actually facing greater financial strain than this group that just got their monthly paycheck. And so what we're going to do is we're going to compare those two groups, essentially. Yeah, I kind of just explained it here, but our specification is going to be very simple. Since we have random variation on whether you get the transfer before or after the exam, we'll just regress our outcome, which is going to be standardized test scores with a mean 0 and standard deviation 1 among the Bolsa Familia test takers, the cash transfer beneficiary test takers. And essentially, it's going to be an ITT framework. People become eligible to withdraw. They may not withdraw. And withdrawal is, in some sense, an endogenous decision. But we can interpret beta as basically the effect of alleviating these end of monthly cycle liquidity constraints on test scores. And if we reject that beta equals 0, that sort of tells us that households are facing some sort of binding constraints at the end of their monthly payment cycles, because otherwise we shouldn't observe any impact. In terms of, I'll skip this quickly, but we have a very much balanced sample as one would expect because of random variation. The group that gets paid before the exam and after, they look very much identical. And importantly, we need to worry about, is there any selection into test taking? Because if getting the transfer before the exam allows you to be more likely to actually show up on the test day, then we need to worry a bit about compositional effects. Thankfully, we don't find any effects on the probability of being in the exam. And so we can interpret our treatment effects as purely cognitive effects of having the cash transfer before the exam. This is basically showing you that our ITT framework, in fact, does generate a sharp difference in liquidity of the household around the exam day. So I'm showing you essentially how long do people take to withdraw their transfer once they become eligible. And 0 would be it's normalized to be the day of the payment. About 80% of people are withdrawing immediately on the same day. And it almost goes up to 100% within 3 days. So we do see that there's one high demand for liquidity of cash transfer beneficiaries, and that indeed this design generates the sharp difference in liquidity that we're trying to measure. Okay, so this is showing you the raw means. What is the impact sorry, let me clarify. This is the raw means. In blue, I'm showing you the group who got the transfer before the exam. In red, the group that get it after. We can see that the average score across all subjects is 0.009 standard deviations higher for the group that get it before the exam. This seems to be mostly driven by the language component and the essay at the end. So to think about magnitude, it's not a big effect, but there's a meta-analysis that was recently done by David Evans at the Center for Global Development. This falls around the 20th percentile of developing country interventions targeting educational outcomes. So it's not massive, but if we think about the variation that we're exploiting, which is simply timing, I don't think we should be expecting massive effects like other massive programs that invest a lot more resources. Now, oops. Okay, I'm going to skip over threats to identification in the interest of time. I think there's one interesting question here, which is there a dose response, right? Do the cognitive effects of getting the transfer scale with the size of the transfer? And we have quite a bit of variation in our sample in transfer size, because this depends on household composition and income. For example, the mean transfer is $94, but the standard deviation is 49. So what we do now is we're going to split the sample into terciles of transfer size, and we're going to see whether the same impact of getting the transfer before versus after the exam is increasing in the size of the transfer. Something to also consider is that large transfer beneficiaries, so the top tercile of transfer size, they not only get bigger transfers, but they're also poorer, they have lower per capita income, and they depend more heavily on Bolsa Familia for their monthly sort of resources. Okay. So the first thing to note is that indeed the effects are actually more than twice as large for the top transfer size tercile. So there seems to be a dose response, which is, I think, what we might expect. The effects are driven mostly by, they're kind of across the board, but they're biggest for the language and the essay component. What is quite interesting is that we don't see any effects for the middle and bottom transfer size tercile. So there's quite a clear dose response here. And we can reject equality of coefficients for the top versus the bottom two terciles of transfer size. Now, what are these heterogeneous effects capturing? We think that this is about economic vulnerability or financial strain. And the reason for that is, first, that if we run causal forest algorithms, let's feed a bunch of characteristics and see what predicts treatment effects. We find that there are proxies of financial strain that predict treatment effect heterogeneity, so for example, income and transfer size, they are the top predictors. If we do the same heterogeneity analysis by terciles of income level, or for example, by what share of their income is coming from the cash transfer every month, we also find this similar pattern of heterogeneity. So it seems to suggest that this is about, the cognitive benefits of getting the transfer early are really increasing in the vulnerability of the household. And this is consistent with behavioral economics literature that shows that cognitive effects of income shocks are also concentrated in the most financially constrained. Okay, so I really don't have much time, unfortunately. So, yeah, one thing I'll tell you is that we can think of many mechanisms that could be impacting cognitive performance. For example, are students better nourished the day of the exam? Are they able to work less on the days leading up to the exam because they don't have to help with the household finances, and instead they're studying more, and that allows them to perform better? So depending on the mechanism, we might expect heterogeneity on the treatment effects by how many days you've had the transfer before the exam, right? For example, if the mechanism is that on exam day there's lower levels of stress, we might expect there to be no heterogeneity by whether I got the transfer the week before the exam or whether I got it one day before the exam. There should be like a flat sort of temporal profile. Conversely, if this is about increased study time or increased educational investments, we might expect that there's a dose response between how many days I've had the transfer before the exam, right? Maybe if I have 5 days to study, thanks to having the exam thanks to having the transfer before the exam, that would allow me to perform better. What we find is that there's no heterogeneity by how many days before the exam you got the transfer. So it seems like the mechanism that's operating here operates at a really quick sort of short term. It could be something like being better nourished the day of the exam, or even bringing a snack to this really long test that might sort of deplete your cognitive resources. Yeah, I think I don't have time for this. Yeah, quickly I'll say that we find that we exploit position variation, so we're able to show that the effects of getting the transfer early are very much concentrated on questions that appear later in the exam, and that sort of suggests that there's a reduction in cognitive fatigue thanks to the cash transfer. We can also show that the types of questions that are driving the effects are the easiest questions, which makes sense. Getting the transfer might make you a bit more sharp mentally on exam day, and maybe you're less likely to make silly mistakes, but it won't make you a genius that suddenly understands the toughest questions, right? So it makes sense that the types of questions that are driving the effects are the easiest ones in some sense. Okay, so I showed you effects on test scores, and particularly for the top transfer size tercile. What we're going to do now is look at longer run outcomes. Again, because this is a high stakes exam that does determine educational trajectories. So for the same group where we saw the treatment effects on cognitive performance, on test scores, we will essentially run the same regression, and we're going to look at college enrollment and graduation. So, sorry. So the first column shows you that those in the top transfer size tercile who got the transfer before the exam, they are 0.7 percentage points more likely to enroll in a university the following year. And this is driven by private colleges, which in some sense makes sense because, as I was saying earlier, the public colleges are actually extremely selective. So even with these treatment effects, they're not shifted above the admission cutoffs. Not only are they more likely to enroll, but if we sort of track these people 8 years later, because of the really rich data that we have in Brazil, we can find that they're actually also more likely to have graduated 8 years later from any university. So this shows that not only are there cognitive effects in the short term on the exam, but there's also long-term implications in terms of human capital accumulation. Next, I'll show you that there's also some effects on labor market outcomes. So Brazil has really high rates of informality, about 39% in 2023, and formal sector jobs are generally much more preferred. They offer employment protection, higher wages, etc. And higher education, having a college degree is strongly predictive of being in formal employment. So again, thanks to very rich data in Brazil and our ability to link using national ID numbers, we can track them and see whether there's also an increase in the probability of being in the formal sector. which is a very highly desirable outcome from a sort of development perspective. So again, we find that consistent with the effects on graduation, we find a 0.1 percentage point increase in formal employment between 5 and 9 years after taking the exam. And this is about a 1.7% increase relative to a mean of 59.4%. In terms of earnings, we don't find any effects, but maybe we shouldn't necessarily expect to, because one, there's already a selection effect of being in the formal sector through treatment. So interpreting any treatment effects on conditional outcomes is kind of tricky. But also, these are early career still, and so there may not be any earnings effects early on in their careers. Okay, I don't know. I guess okay. So to conclude, our key finding is that transfer timing relative to high-stakes events can matter, and it can have meaningful effects for households that receive the largest transfers in particular in our sample, who also happen to be the poorest. In the short term, there's an improvement in cognitive performance of around 0.002 standard deviations that leads to long-term improvements in their life trajectories. They're more likely to have enrolled in a university and to have graduated, and in turn, they have higher rates of formal employment. So sort of stepping back, what this suggests is that end-of-cycle liquidity constraints faced by cash transfer beneficiaries might be significant. And even if they're short-lived, if they happen to coincide with a high-stakes event like the one that I showed you, they can have long-term implications. And potentially there's a policy implication on how can we optimize the payment timing around such key events so that these short-term liquidity constraints don't impact their life trajectories. Yeah, that's all I have.
So I think we squeezed the Q&A a little bit.
Okay.
So we'll take 3 questions.
Okay.
First round, and if time permitting, we'll take the second.
Sure. I'll take notes on my phone, so I'm not texting. Just.
Thank you so much for your very, very nice presentation.
Sorry, where?
Okay. Just a simple question. Your data all relates to 2013, right?
Yeah, the natural experiment happened there.
Has there been any further work on this? Because things might have changed. It's not 2025. 12 years is a long time. And how does the Brazil's economic development or not too good development impacts the cash transfers?
Yeah.
Do the numbers go down, or
As in, are there still as many beneficiaries as back then?
Yeah,
Is that what you mean?
yeah.
In terms of the.
We'll take 2 more questions.
Sure. The program itself, if anything, might be even bigger now. Yeah, it's massive, and I think it's institutionalized. It's enshrined in law, so it's very hard to change its features. In terms of there hasn't been any. I haven't been able to do the same analysis later on because the sharp variation that we're looking at really was pretty unique. And now the exam is done across 2 weeks, and so it doesn't really allow us to do the same analysis the way we do. But the cash transfer itself hasn't changed too much. It's very similar in the components that it has, and if anything, it has grown in size. Yeah.
All right. So we'll take 3 more, and then you should respond in one.
Sorry. Sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Great presentation. So I was really hoping you could share some results with regards to heterogeneity by gender.
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't get much time to spend on the mechanisms. I was hoping if you could talk about how does the cash transfer affect the motivation. And then you show that, the results vary by the subject area, like essay, math.
Yeah.
Could you talk about why do you think there should be variation around those dimensions? Thank you.
So I had a couple of questions here. So households know in advance when they are getting the transfer. So it could be a story that when they're getting a transfer a few days ago, they can just plan better in advance.
Yeah, they should.
I think to sort of just see this, whether this is the mechanism at play, do you do some analysis by seeing the families that have joined the program relatively recently versus those that have joined far back ago? And the second thing would be that your long-term effects, how much of the magnitude of what you're seeing is just driven by having better test scores? Because I believe there are a bunch of studies that look at what happens when a percentage point test score is better. So how much of this is driven by just having better test scores, and how much is it, yes, you relax some liquidity or credit constraints?
Yeah, hi. Great presentation. I'm very envious of the data you have on the ordering of questions and everything. I'm wondering, you say that, they're really poor households, but then your effects are driven by students enrolling in private colleges. If you could talk a bit more about the affordability factor there. Yeah. And then I'm surprised at the effect at graduation. Could you talk a bit about, because it's a cash transfer you're getting right before the entrance test. Do they keep getting it through the 4 years in college? Why are I'm puzzled by the effect at graduation.
Right. Okay.
Sorry, Maroof, if you will please allow me. And just a quick question. I'm wondering about the sort of culture around private tutoring in these sort of communities, and is there any sort of role that might be playing in terms of helping sort of ease the constraint around preparing for the exam just before the exam?
The role
of? Private tutoring.
Private tutoring, yeah. Okay. Okay, sorry, I'll try to remember all of them. So on gender, yeah. There's no heterogeneity by gender. We don't find any effects by gender. Yeah, I was also a bit, I wasn't expecting any necessarily. Could have gone either way. I don't think, it's not a country where gender, obviously women don't have the same rights in many ways, but I don't think the differences are as large as in other settings, potentially. And what was the second? Motivation. Yeah, it's hard. I can't pinpoint that mechanism because unfortunately with admin data, I'm a bit limited in what I can do. I have a field experiment. We have a field experiment now trying to get at mechanisms. Is it about psychological stress being lower? Is it about nutrition? Like what really is driving that? But I can't do anything. Yeah. Okay. Yes. So about the how long they've been exposed essentially to the transfer, right? We don't see any heterogeneity by whether they're recent beneficiaries or whether they've been for a long time. And I do think that the effects, the long-term outcomes, are going through the test scores, right? Because the variation of before versus after happens around the test scores. It doesn't happen later on. And so I think our hypothesis, the causal chain, is that this is going through the performance on the exam. Since we have balance on everything else, it seems like that's the only plausible channel. Yeah. And sorry, private tutoring. Yes, I think that's possible. But then we would expect to see a dose response between how many days you've had the transfer for before the exam. So if I got it a week before and I've had 7 days to have private tutoring, my improvements would be better than if I just got my transfer 2 days before the exam and I only had 2 days of tutoring. So that's kind of one thing that I didn't have time to go through, but you would expect like maybe some temporal profile of some heterogeneity by days since the transfer, and we don't see that. We see like a very flat temporal profile. Thank you.
So the next paper is mental accounting and cash transfers. Till Wicker from Tilburg University. Just to remind everyone, 20 minutes of presentation ideally, and then 10 minutes of Q&A.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the organizers for putting together such a fantastic conference, and I'm honored to be here. My name is Till. I'm a PhD candidate at Tilburg University who's on the job market this year, but what I'm presenting today was initially an idea I applied to grad school with, so it's been incredible to get the funding, execute it, and now present it in front of such a large audience. It's co-authored with my 2 supervisors, and the title is Mental Accounting and Cash Transfers, Experimental Evidence from a Humanitarian Setting. And so cash transfers are ubiquitous across the world as a very popular social protection scheme. In 2020, over $55 billion were spent on cash transfers, of which 60% are unconditional. Here in Pakistan, with the massive BIS program, over $1 billion were spent unconditionally in 2020. And a goal of many of these cash transfer programs is to increase the self-reliance of the recipients, right? So that they're not forever dependent on the cash transfer program, but at some point they've set up a sustainable income source and can provide for their family. Now, if we think about the theory of change, of how this cash transfer would lead to self-sufficiency, this theory of change goes through getting your cash transfer, saving a share of it, trying to invest a share of that into a productive investment, and then over time, generating your own income. However, this requires two components. Firstly, that when you get the cash transfer, you budget and you plan your cash transfer so that you save some of it. And then secondly, it's very easy to say, I'm going to save 20% of my cash transfer, but when the money then actually comes, you're tempted to spend it elsewhere. So you're going to have to commit to this savings plan. And this is a non-trivial challenge. I struggle with this with my paycheck every month. However, there's also some academic evidence to suggest that these commitment challenges are even harder in contexts of scarcity. However, one potential remedy is mental accounting, sort of a Nobel Prize winning contribution, where it has two main components. Basically, rather than seeing money as one big lump sum, you create little separate mental accounts or budgets for specific categories. Like you have a budget for education, a budget for health. And then secondly, while the theoretical foundation of mental accounting doesn't require the second step, all empirical applications also have this commitment aspect. So not only do you make this plan in your head, but you're also committing to it. For example, by having a savings account in your bank account, which you preferably don't touch. And so this paper asks the very simple question of whether an intervention inspired by mental accounting can help cash transfer recipients increase their self-reliance. And so what do? Is we partner with the Danish Refugee Council, one of the largest humanitarian NGOs in the world, who in Uganda are giving a 7-month-long unconditional cash transfer to highly vulnerable households of $25 PPP per household member per month. And all we do is introduce a very simple twist in how the cash transfer is delivered, which harnesses mental accounting. In particular, the sort of status quo of the way the cash transfer is delivered is households come to a reception point every month, receive their cash, and it gets put into one blank envelope. Instead, we offer our treatment households the opportunity to divide the same cash transfer across envelopes with education, health, investments, and the rest. So we're sort of partitioning these separate accounts. Now, these 4 categories emerged as a result of focus group discussions, as households indicated that these were areas of physical and human capital where they would like to have specific accounts for these. However, aside from just this 2-stage treatment, we also introduce a further sub-treatment where we exogenously introduce variation in the budgeting. So for half of the households who were offered these 4 envelopes, we simply ask them, once they opt in to the intervention, how do you want to divide the money across these 4 categories? So they're making an active decision of saying, I want to put 20% in education. While for the other half of the households, they're first shown a default recommendation from the United Nations of how to allocate the money across these 4 categories, and hence, if they accept the default, they don't have to critically think about how they want to divide the money. And so what's that going to allow us to do is these 2 interventions only differ in this budgeting component, which was 5 minutes at the baseline survey. However, the commitment component, receiving these 4 labeled envelopes every single month, remains the same across both treatments. So we can look at the differential effects of the budgeting versus the commitment and how they interact. Okay, so very briefly about the literatures. So we firstly contribute to the literature on behavioral economics or behavioral development economics by being the first study that leverages mental accounting to improve self-reliance through a cash transfer. Now, obviously, we're not the first to address commitment challenges. People in this room have studied this extensively as well. However, we think compared to lockboxes or fixed bank accounts, our envelopes are as soft and as cheap as they can get, right? It's very easy, and one household I even saw them do this, is just take the money out of the envelopes, throw the envelopes away, and then go home, right? So it's very, very soft. And then lastly, there's literature on mental accounting. We're the first ones to incorporate mental accounting within a cash transfer context, and also the first to really look at how budgeting and commitment interact and sort of have an effect on what is quite widely documented as positive effects of mental accounting. Now, from a more policy perspective, obviously there's a large literature on cash transfers as well, where we offer a low-cost, highly scalable intervention that can improve the effectiveness of cash transfers, which is particularly important in humanitarian settings where cash transfers play a huge role, but not only does cost effectiveness matter, but also low-cost interventions given budget constraints. Okay, so I will briefly explain the context that we're working in, because it's very different to Pakistan. And so this is Uganda. Uganda has a population of about 35 million people and hosts almost 2 million refugees. So it's a huge refugee hosting country. Most of these refugees have been in the country for over 5 years. So they're not only here for the short term, but are really trying to build up their lives there. Now, Uganda has a very progressive refugee policy in the sense that refugees are free to live anywhere in the country and can have formal employment. Nevertheless, 91% of refugees live across these refugee settlements, in part because when you come to a refugee settlement, you get given a 30 by 30 meter plot of land and a shelter, and you're only eligible for humanitarian aid, such as World Food Programme food assistance, if you reside in the settlements. Despite this humanitarian aid, refugees are extremely poor. So in our sample at baseline, the average per capita daily income was 26 cents PPP, far below the poverty threshold. And we conduct our experiment in Rhino Camp and Mvepi, which are two adjacent refugee settlements in the northwest. And so this is what a refugee settlement looks like, very similar to a typical village you might see in rural Africa. But we can see here, the house has a shelter, and then it has a sort of a man-constructed fence around their little small-scale agriculture. Now, within this context, we identify 861 households who are going to be recipients of an unconditional cash transfer program that equals $25 PPP per month for 7 months. And hence the total cash transfer value is over $1,000 PPP. And for 95% of the households, this exceeds their monthly income. So it's a really large income shock given the context. And we have our control group who received these monthly cash transfers in the one large envelope, the status quo of how the NGO did it at the time. And then we have our mental accounting with choice treatment, where households at the baseline survey were offered the opportunity to opt in for the 4 envelopes. If they opted in, we asked them, okay, how do you want to divide the money across these 4 categories? And then that was executed at future cash transfers. If they decided they didn't want the 4 envelopes, then they just received the 1 envelope, the status quo. Our second treatment arm is the mental accounting with default, where again, households were offered the opportunity to opt in to the cash transfer. And then once they opted in, they were first shown a default recommendation from the United Nations with sort of these percentages of allocations across these 4 categories. They could either accept this default recommendation or they could adjust. If they would adjust, they would effectively end up in this situation of self-choice. However, if they would reject, they would return back to the 1 envelope setting. So we see very, very high uptake of our soft commitment device. So 93 and 94% of households who get offered the envelopes opt in. And of those who were shown the default, 96% accept the default. So we have some pretty strong exogenous variation in whether households actively chose their budgets in the mental accounting with choice treatment or accepted the default. Now, in line with our sort of pre-registered or pre-analysis plan and theory of change, the majority of households said this would help them with their budgeting and subsequent financial discipline. Now, because of this variation in endogenous and exogenous allocations across these 4 categories, we see variation both in the means as well as the distributions of how the money is allocated across these 4 categories between the 2 treatment arms. In particular, households who make the choice themselves allocate more money to education and slightly less to productive investments. Now, just very quickly, this is what the logistics were. So at a pre-specified day, pre-specified location, the households would come and collect their cash from a literal cash van. And then after that would go to our team of envelope distributors, and there they would be verified whether you're receiving 1 envelope or 4 envelopes. If you're receiving 4 envelopes, then they would divide the money across these 4 categories, and then they would go home. So it's very easily integrated within the existing operations. Now, in terms of the timeline, we did our baseline survey immediately after the first cash transfer program. So the first month, everyone received the status quo program. This was due to logistical challenges. But then we did a midline survey immediately after the end of the cash transfer program and came back 1 year later, okay, to look at longer term outcomes. Now, I'm going to report the longer-term outcomes first. In particular, looking first at productive and lumpy investments. We see increases of about 25% and 30% in productive investments, in particular in these lumpy investments. So rather than buying one chicken every month, people accumulate their assets in order to buy a pig a couple months later. Now, these larger investments translate into both a higher monthly income and higher savings of about 20%. Now, we don't see any effect on durable goods, slight reductions in educational expenditures, and we see a decrease in health-related expenditures. However, this is more a question of timing. As we'll see at the midline survey, households in our treatment group are actually spending more on health investments. So if we look at baseline to end line, there's no change in health-related expenditures. It's just a question of the timing. Now, the big question is obviously, how did households finance these 25% larger investments? For that, we go back to the midline survey. There, we see increases in both the savings as well as the loans of about 70%, right? And so these savings are financed in part through sacrifices in terms of durable goods as well as investments. And with these loans, thank you, these were a big conundrum to us because obviously taking out a loan is quite risky, especially in these settlements. Interest rates are at about 10% a month. And so taking out these large loans can be quite a concern. However, through focus group discussions, households said that they took out these loans in order to top up the savings that they'd accumulated in order to make these larger lumpy investments. Now, looking at these two sub-treatments where one sort of primarily accepted the default and the other one made the explicit choice themselves, we see that at end line, most of the treatment effects are driven by households, especially when it comes to the income and the savings, by households who budgeted themselves, right? So I think this is really beautiful because that means the government doesn't always know better. But so we see that with respect to income and savings, the households that chose themselves had more savings and income than households that accepted the default, and compared to the control group, basically across the mean. Now, we'll get to why the households in the default had larger investments that don't translate to greater income. Okay, and so if we look at midline, the households that accepted the defaults, in addition to taking out these larger savings, also took out larger loans. So all of the treatment effects of these pooled two interventions on loans are entirely driven by households that accepted the default. And basically, through focus group discussions, we learned that this UN recommended allocation put too little money in the education basket, as a result of which households moved money from the investment to the education basket to pay for their children's school fees, but still wanted to make these investments. And so they took out loans in order to top up their investment category. Okay, so looking more deeply into the mechanisms of how this intervention actually affected investments, so we see that the intervention increased lumpy investments in terms of the average treatment effects. But if we think similar to Axel's study of larger households receive a larger cash transfer, and so they would put more money in the investment envelope, we also see that for larger households, they don't make more investments in general, but they make more productive investments. Or sorry, more lumpy investments. So they've accumulated more money and make larger investments. Similarly, what we see is that households, instead of, once they get the cash, immediately buying a chicken or buying some seeds for their land, they accumulate income and hence delay their investments. But then once they've accumulated enough, they make investments into enterprises, which is a diversification of the income source, because typically it's either agriculture or livestock. And we find this to be particularly pronounced in the self-choice treatment. And our explanation for that is that the households in the default treatment took out these loans, which have a 10% interest per month, and so you have to start paying back this immediately. And so as a result, if you have a chicken that lays eggs that you can sell in the market, you're going to generate an immediate return. Well, if you set up an enterprise, it might take a couple of weeks or months before customers start coming to you, and you can't really afford that if you have to repay your loan immediately. Now, my favorite part of this paper is that 1 year after the end of the intervention, 37% of households were still using these envelopes, suggesting that there was really a behavioral change. And we call these households the persistent users. Now, compared to non-persistent users at baseline, these households had more loans, suggesting greater financial strain. They were younger, arrived later in the settlements, but specifically they had greater desire for self-sufficiency. So they had greater expectations of what their savings would be and greater aspirations of what they wanted their income to be. And in line with sort of what we pre-registered, these households were also the ones that were more likely to say, okay, this intervention is going to help me with budgeting and financial discipline. So very much in line with our theory of change. And when we do sort of a propensity score matching, then the treatment effects are substantially larger for these persistent users than the non-persistent users, right? So this induced behavioral change seems to reap benefits 1 year down the line. Now, given we have these two subtreatments, we can talk about the role of budgeting as well as commitment and how they interact. So firstly, we see that this active budgeting, where at baseline you make the choice of how to divide the money across the categories, reinforces this perceived value of this soft commitment device. So we see that households that made an active choice at baseline are statistically significantly more likely to still be using this 4 envelopes 1 year later, right? Even once the cash transfer ends and they no longer receive a reminder of what their initial allocation was, and hence the intervention is purely a commitment, still households are more likely to use this commitment device after making the initial choice. However, when we gave the envelopes to the households, we intentionally didn't seal the envelopes, okay? However, households could have chosen themselves to seal the envelopes and hence make the commitment device a little bit harder, because then you have to actively open the envelope and take the money out. Now we see that households that made the active choice themselves are less likely to seal this envelope, okay? So less likely to demand this harder commitment device, suggesting that self-choosing your budgets almost acts as an internal commitment constraint that substitutes this harder external commitment. So this is sort of what we think is quite an interesting interaction between budgeting and commitment. And yeah, for future research, we'd love to look more into this. Now, what's also interesting is that most of our treatment effects are driven for the investment, while we don't see much about health and education. And so we think we're quite uniquely positioned to talk about this because we're one of the first studies that looks at commitment devices for different kind of expenditure categories. And in particular, investments, education, and health differ across 3 key dimensions in terms of the predictability of school fees are due on this day. However, I don't know when I'm going to make my productive investments. The flexibility of if I don't pay my school fees today, my kid's not going to school. However, if I don't make an investment today, I can always make it tomorrow. And then lastly, the salience of if I don't send my kids to school, they're going to bother me all day. However, if I don't buy a chicken, I'm not going to see a missing chicken running around in my farm, right? And we basically see that across, so investments differ from the other 3 categories in the sense that they're very flexible and the salience of not making the investment is very low. And this is where we find that this budgeting and commitment, the foundations of mental accounting, are really effective. Now, we rule out several other mechanisms, which for the interest of time, I'm not gonna bore you with, but we're gonna talk about cost effectiveness as well, because the intervention was incredibly cheap. So per household for 7 months, it cost less than $2 PPP, and yet we see sort of quite substantial changes in income and savings, resulting in per dollar spent around 0.8 to 0.9 standard deviation increases 1 year after the end of the intervention. Now, we pre-register that we'll benchmark this against Agarwal et al., who introduced lockboxes in Malawi, which is a firmer or a stronger type of commitment. And there we see that it's still very cost effective, but ours is slightly more cost effective. Now, in conclusion, we introduced this very simple tweak within an ongoing cash transfer program, and we find that it boosts savings at midline and then afterwards facilitates these lumpy investments. We see that there's this long-run use of the commitment device, with 37% of households still using them, but we also see that the effectiveness of this mental accounting intervention depends on what you're trying to spend the money on. Now, we think that this policy is, or this intervention is highly policy relevant, scalable, and cost-effective, and in particular, sort of where we're excited to take this literature is now that cash transfers are moving digital, including here in Pakistan, sort of incorporating these commitment devices within digital mobile money wallets or savings accounts is a really promising future agenda. Now, obviously, as everyone who's done an RCT knows, it takes a village, so I'm going to leave it here, but thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So we'll take 3 questions at a time, and then you can respond.
Yeah, great.
Okay, So thank you very much for the very interesting study. I'm just wondering, refugees are a specialized group of population which have gone through extreme mental stress and they have lots of vulnerabilities and unpredictable future. Having them as a group of people, experimenting this kind of thing, where they don't know where after a few years where they will be. So I'm just curious about the whole premise. So they might have an expectation if they sign up for this experiment and they behave in a certain way, that might accrue them some benefits if they go by that way. And because you're conducting an N-line after a year. So what are your thoughts about ruling out this kind of effect which is influencing their behavior? Thank you.
Sorry if I missed this, but I am wondering why give them option to self-select into both treatments? Because usually when we are doing RCTs, that's the last thing we want to do. So I don't know if there is a reason behind it by the study design you have, or was it a cultural reasons there?
Yeah, very interesting presentation. I was wondering.
Yes.
I was wondering that who is the target recipient? So who comes to actually collect the money? Is it the male in the household, the female in the household, always the male? I think it would be really interesting to look at heterogeneity by who the recipient is, especially in light of these results where you're actually seeing a decrease in health and education and keeping in line literature that shows that, resource. And my second question was, so you do an end line after 1 year, and I'm wondering, are these like settlements permanent in the sense that what was attrition like? Were you able to go back to everybody after a year? Yeah.
Right. Thank you. So I'll first answer those 3 questions, and I'll also be here during the break to answer any questions. Firstly, I agree. Refugees are a special population. We think the behavioral mechanisms here are presentable beyond just refugees, but specifically to your question of what I think is getting at experimental demand bias of if I tell you what you want to hear, I'm going to get more aid in the future. Now, actually, and this is a separate sort of paper I'm exploring, in a refugee settlement, the incentives are the opposite way. The more vulnerable you seem, the more likely you are to receive assistance. And so in that sense, there's actually an incentive to underreport how well you are doing, such that with the hope, okay, this information gets passed on to the NGO, and then I'll receive more aid in the future. So we also, in our paper, we also ask about other forms of humanitarian assistance, and we actually see that households in our treatment group are less likely to receive other forms of humanitarian assistance. So in that sense, we actually think we're maybe estimating a lower bound. But great question, and I'm happy to chat more about it afterwards. In terms of the self-selection into both treatments, I think I didn't explain that very clearly then. So we have 3 treatment arms, and they're all separate. So households are randomized into this, or the control group. So in that sense, there's no self-selection. The variation between these 2 treatments is simply whether you're making the choice yourself or whether you're being shown a default before you make a choice, right? Because you still have to make a choice of whether I accept the default or whether I reject it. But I'm also happy to discuss offline. And in terms of the target recipient, I think this is where this population differs from maybe if we do this study among a normal Ugandan family, in the sense that 80% of our household heads are actually female who are receiving the cash transfer, because the men oftentimes stay in South Sudan or Congo to fight the wars while sending their family to safety. And so as a result of that, we're not really powered to look at much heterogeneity by whether the head of the household is a female or a male. But yeah, we're in discussions for follow-up studies among different samples where this is a super important dimension. I completely agree. Thank you.
So we can take another round of 3 questions.
Great.
Thank you. Great presentation. I'm just curious to know that, do you know at baseline what are the norms in the household around budgeting and planning? Because I mean, my sense is that, households generally know that, with the given financial resources, what exactly do they want to spend those resources on? And it might not be as structured as, your treatment is, but, just curious to know at baseline, do you have that information or not?
Hi, thank you. Great presentation. Love the work. I'm just wondering about the mechanism. So when you started the rollout, did you elicit any preferences about what they want to spend on? And what do you think? The mental accounting, is it making people time consistent in that way that they could stick with their preferences and that's what driving the effects? Or what is really causing the mental accounting to work in that sense? Are they more in tune with what they actually wanted to do because of this, or is there something else?
Hi. Sorry. Yeah, great presentation. Just one question about the size of the cash transfer. So I think you mentioned earlier that this is, it's like larger than most of their monthly income. So do you think that there could be like any variation in the size of the cash transfers which would account for different effect, like in the treatment, like if you varied the size of the cash transfer, because maybe they like feel entitled because they're receiving such a large sum of money that like it influences their behavior somehow?
All great questions. So firstly, in terms of the baseline norms of budgeting and planning, so again, I think it's a specific sample in the sense that because we have female-headed households, they indicated a baseline that this is, and during our focus group discussions, that this is the first time that they're in charge of the family household. So in South Sudan and Congo, there are laws written into the government that the man is the head of the household and makes budgeting decisions. So that's why we think, especially that's why we think the default uptake was so high, because households didn't really have much of an idea of how to allocate across categories, and hence just accepted the default recommendation. Now, in other settings, this might differ, right? The more experience you get with budgeting and planning, maybe you don't need these commitment devices, although from personal experience, I still need it. But yeah, that's area for future research, right? And that's super exciting. In terms of what the mechanisms are, so we measured sort of time consistency at base, or being a hyperbolic discounter. We don't find any heterogeneity along that dimension. Now, that was unincentivized, so maybe if we would have added a financial stake, we would have gotten some more reliable data. But I think sort of what's really driving this mechanism is this monthly reminder of how you want to spend the money and then being able to commit to that, right? And that's why I think we see these differences between the defaults and the self-choice treatment. In terms of the last question about the size of the cash transfer, indeed, so it is a sizable cash transfer for the setting, but the PPP conversion is favorable. So it's $8 actually, right? So for any of us, that wouldn't make a huge life-changing difference. And so this is also super interesting, right? Because if you get a lump sum, maybe you don't need this commitment because you can make these productive investments immediately. And so this is a very interesting question, right? Whether the size of the cash transfer and this intervention or other sort of behavioral interventions, what their interlinkages are. And if you have any ideas, happy to hear them. But thank you everyone for the great questions, and I'll stick around.